The scream that tore from Pearl Bishop's throat died against the suffocating palm clamped over her mouth. And in that moment of terror, she knew with absolute certainty that this night would be her last. The stagecoach lay overturned 30 yards behind her, wheels still spinning lazily in the moonlight, and the 3 men who had ambushed it now dragged her deeper into the California wilderness while her fellow passengers lay motionless in the dust. It was August of 1876, and Pearl had survived 22 years on this earth, only to meet her end in the mountains outside Sacramento, far from the modest seamstress shop she had inherited from her mother in San Francisco. The largest of the bandits yanked her by the hair, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco as he leaned close. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? Worth more than all the gold in that strongbox." Pearl thrashed against his grip, her boot heels scraping uselessly against the rocky ground. The other 2 men laughed, and one of them started unbuckling his belt. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst through her ribcage. This was how it ended. This was how she died. Then the night exploded. The crack of a rifle shot split the darkness, and the man holding Pearl's hair stumbled backward, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. He released her with a howl of pain, and Pearl hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. More gunfire followed, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos in brief, terrifying snapshots. The bandits scattered, returning fire wildly into the trees, but their shots found only empty air. A massive shape emerged from the shadows, moving with the fluid grace of a mountain lion despite his enormous size. Pearl's first coherent thought was that she had conjured some ancient god from the wilderness itself. The man stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders straining against a buckskin shirt that had seen better days. Long dark hair, nearly black in the moonlight, hung past his collar, and even in the dim light she could see the corded muscles of his forearms as he worked the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Leave," he commanded, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "Leave now, or the next shot goes through bone instead of muscle." The bandits needed no further encouragement. They scrambled for their horses, the wounded man clutching his shoulder as his companions hauled him into the saddle. Within seconds, the thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the chirping of crickets and Pearl's ragged breathing. The giant turned to face her, and Pearl instinctively scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough earth. He lowered his rifle immediately, raising one large hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentler than before but no less deep. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Gideon Ashford. I have a cabin about 2 miles north of here. You are safe now." Pearl opened her mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. The terror that had gripped her moments ago still held her vocal cords in an iron fist. She could only stare at this mountain of a man who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. Gideon took a cautious step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone approaching a spooked horse. "Can you stand? Are you injured?" She managed to shake her head, though she was not entirely certain it was true. Everything hurt, but whether from the crash or the rough handling or simply the overwhelming surge of fear, she could not say. "The stagecoach," she finally managed to whisper. "The others, the driver and the guard." "An older couple, are they?" Gideon's expression darkened. "I will check on them, but first I need to know you can stand on your own." He extended his hand toward her, and Pearl found herself staring at it for a long moment. It was enormous, the fingers thick and calloused, the kind of hand that had known hard labor and harder living. Yet he held it steady, palm up, waiting for her to make the choice. She placed her smaller hand in his, and he pulled her to her feet with such ease that she might have weighed nothing at all. Up close, he was even more imposing. The buckskin shirt revealed glimpses of a chest as solid as the mountain granite, and his arms were roped with muscle that spoke of a lifetime spent wrestling with the wilderness. His face was weathered but handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of dark stubble and eyes that, even in the moonlight, she could see were a striking shade of gray. "Wait here," he instructed, already moving toward the overturned stagecoach. Pearl watched him go, her legs trembling beneath her skirts. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the night had become. Or perhaps she had simply stopped noticing anything beyond her own terror until now. Gideon knelt beside the stagecoach, checking each passenger with methodical efficiency. Pearl saw his shoulders sag slightly and her heart sank. When he returned, his expression confirmed her fears. "The driver and guard died in the crash," he said quietly. "Their necks were broken. The older couple as well. I am sorry." Pearl felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. She had not known any of them well. The driver had helped her with her trunk in Sacramento. The guard had tipped his hat and called her Miss with a friendly smile. The elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, had been married for 40 years and were traveling to visit their daughter in Bakersfield. Mrs. Patterson had shared her apple preserves with Pearl during one of their brief stops. "We cannot leave them like this," Pearl heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant and strange to her own ears. "We will not," Gideon assured her. "But we cannot tend to them tonight. Those bandits may return with reinforcements and you need shelter and warmth. My cabin is defensible. In the morning I will ride to the nearest town and report this. The bodies will be recovered and given proper burial." Pearl knew he was right, but guilt gnawed at her nonetheless. "My trunk. I need my trunk." Gideon did not question her. He simply walked to the overturned luggage boot and began extracting the scattered bags and cases. "Which one?" "The black leather one with the brass corners," Pearl said, moving to help him. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip anything, but she needed to do something, needed to feel less helpless than she had moments ago. Gideon found her trunk and hefted it onto his shoulder as though it weighed no more than a sack of flour. In his other hand, he carried his rifle. "Can you walk 2 miles?" Pearl nodded, though in truth she was not certain. But the alternative was staying here among the dead, and that thought filled her with a dread that somehow exceeded even the terror of the attack. They set off into the darkness, Gideon leading the way with confident strides that suggested he could navigate these mountains blindfolded. Pearl struggled to keep pace, her fashionable boots utterly unsuited for the rough terrain. She stumbled repeatedly over rocks and roots she could not see in the gloom, and each time Gideon would pause, waiting patiently for her to catch up. "Here," he said finally, stopping beside a fallen log. He set down her trunk and shrugged off the heavy pack he had been carrying on his back. From it, he produced a pair of well-worn moccasins. "Your feet are about the same size as my sister's were. These will serve you better than those boots." Pearl accepted them gratefully, sitting on the log to make the exchange. The moccasins were indeed much more comfortable, the soft leather conforming to her feet. "Were?" she asked softly, noting his use of past tense. "She died 5 years ago," Gideon said, his voice neutral but not cold. "Fever took her and my mother both same winter. My father passed the year before that. Hunting accident." "I am sorry," Pearl whispered, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. Gideon shouldered her trunk again and resumed walking. "Life in the mountains is not for the faint of heart. But it is honest work, and there is freedom here you will not find in the cities." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional hoot of an owl. Pearl's mind raced with 1,000 questions, but exhaustion was beginning to settle over her like a heavy blanket, dulling the sharp edges of her fear. She found herself focusing on Gideon's broad back, using it as a landmark in the darkness, trusting that he would lead her somewhere safe. "Why were you out here?" she finally asked. "In the middle of the night, I mean." "Heard the shots from the ambush," Gideon replied. "I was checking my trap lines heading home. When I heard the commotion, I came to investigate, got there just as those men were dragging you off." "You saved my life," Pearl said, the full weight of that realization settling over her. "If you had not been there." "But I was there," Gideon interrupted gently. "And you are safe now. That is what matters." They crested a ridge, and Pearl saw a warm glow of light in the distance. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a sturdy log cabin, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A small barn stood nearby, and she could hear the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. Gideon led her to the cabin's front door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was simple but scrupulously clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling behind an iron grate. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a sturdy table and chairs on one side and a pair of well-worn leather chairs near the fire. Shelves lined the walls, holding books and supplies in neat rows. A doorway in the back wall presumably led to a bedroom. "Sit," Gideon instructed, nodding toward one of the chairs by the fire. He set her trunk down near the door and propped his rifle against the wall. "I will make coffee." Pearl sank into the chair, and the moment she did, the last reserves of her strength seemed to evaporate. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Gideon moved about the kitchen with surprising grace for a man his size, stoking the fire in the cooking stove and setting a battered coffee pot to boil. His movements were economical and practiced, speaking of long years of self-sufficiency. "Here," he said, pressing a steaming tin cup into her hands a few minutes later. The coffee was strong and bitter, but the warmth of it spreading through her chest was exactly what she needed. Gideon settled into the other chair, his own cup cradled in those massive hands. "What is your name?" he asked. "I gave you mine, but we have not been properly introduced." "Pearl Bishop," she replied, managing a weak smile. "I am a seamstress from San Francisco, or I was. I sold the shop 2 weeks ago. I was traveling to Wasco to start fresh. A friend from my childhood married a rancher there. She wrote to me, said there was need for someone who could sew in that town, said it was a good place for new beginnings." Gideon nodded slowly. "Wasco is about 30 miles southwest of here. You were on the right road, just had the misfortune of running into Dutch Mayer's gang. They have been plaguing these parts for months now. The law has not been able to catch them." "The man you shot," Pearl said. "Will he tell others about you? Will they come for revenge?" "They might try," Gideon acknowledged, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "But this cabin is built to withstand trouble. Solid logs, narrow windows, good sight lines. And I know these mountains like I know my own heartbeat. They will not take me by surprise." Pearl shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "I do not want to bring danger to your door." "The danger was already here," Gideon said firmly. "Mayer's gang has been growing bolder. It was only a matter of time before they crossed a line that could not be ignored. What happened tonight will force the marshal's hand. There will be a reckoning." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee. Pearl found her gaze returning again and again to Gideon's face, studying him in the better light of the cabin. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of rugged features that would never be called pretty, but possessed a raw masculine appeal that was undeniable. There was a scar along his left temple, faded with age, and his hands bore the marks of countless small injuries that had healed and left their stories behind. "You must be exhausted," Gideon said eventually, rising from his chair. "You can have the bed. I will sleep out here." Pearl started to protest, but he silenced her with a gentle shake of his head. "I insist. You have been through an ordeal tonight. You need proper rest." He led her to the bedroom, which was as spartanly furnished as the rest of the cabin. A large bed frame crafted from rough-hewn logs held a thick mattress that looked surprisingly comfortable. Quilts were folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and a simple dresser stood against one wall. "I will bring your trunk in," Gideon said. "There is a wash basin on the dresser and the water in the pitcher is fresh. If you need anything, just call out. I will be right outside." He left her alone, closing the door quietly behind him. Pearl stood in the center of the room, suddenly aware of just how filthy she was. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and she could feel grit on her skin. She used the water from the pitcher to wash her face and hands, the cold shocking against her heated skin. A soft knock preceded Gideon's return. He carried her trunk easily, setting it down near the dresser before retreating again without a word. Pearl opened the trunk and pulled out her nightgown, changing quickly out of her ruined traveling dress. The familiar routine of preparing for bed helped calm her racing thoughts, though her hands still trembled as she braided her hair. She climbed into the bed, pulling the heavy quilts up to her chin. The mattress was indeed comfortable, the bedding clean and smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke. But as soon as she closed her eyes, the events of the night came rushing back. She saw the overturned stagecoach, felt the bandits' cruel grip on her hair, heard the gunshots ringing in her ears. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She stared at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that she was safe, that the danger had passed. But every creak of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind against the windows sent fresh spikes of terror through her. She had never been a fearful person, but tonight had shown her just how fragile life was, how quickly safety could become peril. Hours passed. Pearl could hear Gideon moving about in the other room, the soft sounds of him banking the fire and settling in for the night. She wanted to call out to him, to ask him to stay where she could see him, but pride kept her silent. She was a grown woman, not a child afraid of the dark. But when she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, nightmares seized her immediately. She was back in the bandits' grip, but this time Gideon did not appear. She screamed and screamed, but no sound emerged. Rough hands tore at her clothes, cruel laughter echoing in her ears. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed. Tears streamed down her face, and her whole body shook with sobs she could not control. She pressed her hands over her mouth, trying to muffle the sounds, not wanting to wake Gideon. But the bedroom door opened almost immediately, and Gideon appeared, his hair loose around his shoulders and his shirt unbuttoned. In the dim light spilling from the main room, she could see the powerful muscles of his chest and abdomen, each one clearly defined. Pearl. His voice was soft with concern. "What is wrong?" "I am sorry," she choked out between sobs. "I did not mean to wake you. I just cannot stop seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I am back there and they are hurting me, and you are not coming, and I am going to die." Gideon crossed the room in 3 long strides and sat on the edge of the bed. "You are safe," he said firmly. "I promise you, Pearl, you are safe here." "I know," she whispered. "I know that in my mind, but my body does not seem to understand. I am so afraid." "Fear is not weakness," Gideon said. "Fear is your body's way of keeping you alive. What you experienced tonight would terrify anyone. You do not need to apologize for it." Pearl wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. I have never felt like this before. I have always been independent, capable. But right now I feel like a frightened child. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then he said, "When I was 12, a bear attacked my father while we were hunting. He killed it, but not before it mauled him badly. I watched him nearly die, watched him scream in pain as my mother stitched his wounds. For months after, I had nightmares. I would wake up screaming, certain I could hear that bear roaring outside my window." "What made them stop?" Pearl asked. "Time," Gideon said simply. "And the knowledge that I was not alone. My father sat with me many nights, just like I am sitting with you now. He told me that I was safe, that he would always protect me. Eventually, I started to believe it." Pearl looked at him, this mountain of a man who seemed as immovable as the peaks that surrounded them. "You will leave in the morning to report the attack." "What if those bandits come back while you are gone?" "They will not," Gideon said with absolute certainty. "They are cowards who prey on the weak and defenseless. They know I am neither. And even if they were foolish enough to try, this cabin can be secured from the inside. I will show you how before I leave. But what if something happens to you while you are gone?" The words spilled out before Pearl could stop them, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She had known this man for mere hours, yet the thought of him riding off into danger filled her with dread. Gideon's stern expression softened slightly. "I have been taking care of myself in these mountains for a long time, Pearl. I know how to handle men like Mayer and his gang. I will be careful and I will come back. I give you my word." Pearl nodded, though the fear still coiled tight in her chest. She lay back down, pulling the quilts around her, but she knew sleep would not come, not while her mind continued to replay the attack over and over. "Would it help if I stayed?" Gideon asked quietly. "I can sit in that chair by the door. That way, if you wake again, you will know someone is here." Relief flooded through Pearl so intensely it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Would you?" "I know it is improper, and I know I am being foolish, but I just cannot bear the thought of being alone right now." "You are not being foolish," Gideon said firmly. He rose and retrieved the simple wooden chair from the corner, positioning it near the door where he could see both the entrance and the bed. "Try to rest. I will be right here." Pearl closed her eyes, and this time, knowing that Gideon was there, solid and real and watchful, the terror did not immediately seize her. She could hear his steady breathing, could sense his presence like a shield against the darkness. Slowly, gradually, exhaustion pulled her under into a dreamless sleep. When she woke, pale morning light was streaming through the window, and Gideon was still in the chair, though he was slumped slightly to one side, clearly asleep. Pearl studied him in the growing light, noting the way his long hair fell across his face, the rise and fall of his powerful chest, the way his large hands rested loosely on the arms of the chair even in sleep. She slipped quietly out of bed, not wanting to wake him. He had stayed up all night watching over her, and she owed him what rest he could get. She found her dressing gown in her trunk and wrapped it around herself before padding quietly into the main room. The cabin looked different in daylight. The shelves she had noticed last night held not just supplies but a surprising number of books, their spines worn from frequent reading. She recognized some of the titles: Shakespeare, Homer, Whitman. There were also practical volumes on animal husbandry, wilderness survival, and medicine. Pearl busied herself with the stove, managing to coax the fire back to life and set a pot of coffee brewing. She found bread in the larder, along with butter and jam, and set about preparing a simple breakfast. The domesticity of the task helped settle her nerves, giving her something productive to focus on. She was just setting the table when she heard movement from the bedroom. Gideon emerged, his hair hastily tied back, his shirt properly buttoned now. He looked surprised to find breakfast waiting. "You did not need to do that," he said, though she could hear the appreciation in his voice. "You saved my life and then stayed up all night watching over me," Pearl replied. "Making breakfast is the least I can do." They ate in companionable silence, and Pearl marveled at how comfortable it felt to share this quiet morning with a man who had been a complete stranger mere hours ago. There was something solid and reassuring about Gideon's presence, something that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. "I need to ride to Kernville," Gideon said as they finished eating. "It is the nearest town with a proper law presence. The marshal there is a good man. He will organize a party to recover the bodies and go after Mayer's gang." Pearl's chest tightened with anxiety, but she forced herself to nod calmly. "How long will you be gone?" "Most of the day," Gideon admitted. "It is a hard 4-hour ride each way, and I will need to spend time explaining what happened and giving descriptions of the bandits. But I will be back before dark. I promise you that." He showed her how to secure the cabin, demonstrating the heavy bar that could be dropped across the door and the shutters that could be latched over the windows from the inside. He left her his spare rifle and showed her how to load and fire it, though his expression suggested he did not truly believe she would need it. "If anyone approaches, you call out and ask them to identify themselves," he instructed. "If you do not recognize their voice, or if they try to force entry, you shoot through the door. Aim low. The logs are thick enough to slow the bullet, but it will still give them something to think about." Pearl tried to commit everything to memory, though her hands shook as she handled the rifle. Gideon covered her hands with his own, steadying them. "You are stronger than you think," he said quietly. "You survived last night. You will survive today." After he left, the cabin felt impossibly empty. Pearl kept herself busy, washing the breakfast dishes, tidying the already immaculate main room, even doing some mending on the clothes she found in Gideon's basket. But as the hours crept by, her anxiety grew. Every sound outside made her jump. Every bird call or snapping twig sent her heart racing. She tried to read, selecting a volume of Whitman's poetry from the shelf, but the words blurred on the page. She tried to nap, but sleep eluded her. Finally, she simply sat in one of the chairs by the cold fireplace, the rifle across her lap, and waited. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Pearl's heart leapt into her throat and she gripped the rifle tightly, moving to the door. "Who is there?" she called out, proud that her voice only shook slightly. "It is me, Pearl. Gideon." Relief washed over her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. She lifted the heavy bar and threw open the door, and there he was, sitting astride a massive chestnut gelding, looking tired but whole. Gideon dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, then turned to face her. Something in her expression must have revealed the depth of her relief, because his stern features softened. "I told you I would come back," he said gently. "I know," Pearl replied, "but knowing and believing are sometimes two different things." He nodded, understanding in his gray eyes. "The marshal is organizing a recovery party. They will head out at first light tomorrow. I gave them directions to the stage coach. I also told them about you, that you survived the attack and are recovering here. He will want to speak with you eventually, get your account of what happened, but I told him it could wait a few days." "Thank you," Pearl whispered. The thought of recounting the attack to a room full of strangers made her stomach churn. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Gideon went about his daily tasks, checking his trap lines, tending to his small garden, chopping wood for the coming winter. Pearl helped where she could, cooking meals, mending clothes, and slowly beginning to feel less like a frightened victim and more like herself again. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives. Pearl told him about growing up in San Francisco, about learning to sew from her mother, about the loneliness that had settled over her after her mother's death 2 years ago. Gideon spoke of his childhood in these mountains, of learning to hunt and trap from his father, of the harsh winters and glorious summers, of the freedom and solitude he had come to cherish. But the nights remained difficult. Pearl could not bear to sleep alone, could not close her eyes without the nightmares creeping in. And every night, without complaint or judgment, Gideon took up his post in the chair by her door, standing guard while she slept. It was on the 5th night that Pearl woke in the early hours of the morning and found herself watching him sleep. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating his face, and she was struck by how peaceful he looked, how different from the fierce protector who had saved her life. There was gentleness beneath all that strength, a kindness that he seemed almost embarrassed to show. "You are staring," Gideon murmured without opening his eyes, and Pearl felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to wake you. You did not." He opened his eyes and looked at her, his gray gaze steady. "I am a light sleeper, force of habit." Pearl sat up, pulling the quilts around her shoulders. "This cannot continue, Gideon. You cannot spend every night sleeping in a chair. It is not fair to you." "I do not mind," he replied simply. "But I mind," Pearl insisted. "You have already done so much for me. I cannot keep taking advantage of your kindness." Gideon rose from the chair and crossed to the bed, sitting on the edge as he had that first night. "You are not taking advantage of anything, Pearl. You need time to heal. There is no shame in that." "But what kind of life is this for you?" Pearl asked. "You did not ask for any of this. You did not ask for me to become your responsibility." "No," Gideon agreed. "I did not ask for it, but I do not regret it either." Something in the way he said it made Pearl's heart skip a beat. She studied his face in the moonlight, searching for the meaning behind his words. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why do you not regret it?" Gideon was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she could not quite name. "Because for the first time in 5 years, this cabin does not feel empty. Because hearing you moving about during the day, hearing you hum while you cook, hearing you breathe while you sleep, it reminds me that I am not alone in this world. And that is a gift I did not know I needed until you arrived." Pearl's breath caught in her throat. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bed. His hand was so much larger than hers, calloused and scarred, but it was warm and solid and real. "I have never felt safer than I do here with you," she admitted. "I had never slept without fear until now. Every night in San Francisco, I would lie awake listening to the sounds of the city, wondering if someone would try to break in, wondering if I would wake to find my shop robbed or worse. But here, even after everything that happened, even with nightmares haunting me, I feel safe. Because you stand guard, because you promised me I was safe and I believe you." Gideon turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "You are safe, Pearl, always. For as long as you are here, I will protect you, I swear it." The intensity in his eyes made her heart race, but not with fear this time. This was something else entirely, something warm and thrilling and terrifying in its own way. "What if I want to stay?" The words left her lips before she could second-guess them. "What if I do not want to continue on to Wasco? What if I want to stay here?" Gideon's grip on her hand tightened. "Are you certain? Life in these mountains is hard, Pearl. It is not like the city. Winters are brutal. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. You would be isolated, cut off from the world for months at a time." "I know," Pearl said. "But I would not be alone. I would be with you." "Pearl," Gideon said, his voice strained, "you have been through a terrible ordeal. Your emotions are running high. You should not make decisions like this when you are still recovering. Do not dismiss my feelings as some kind of temporary confusion, Pearl said firmly, pulling her hand away. I am not a child, Gideon. I know my own mind. And I know that in the past 5 days I have felt more alive, more myself than I have in the 2 years since my mother died. Yes, I am still recovering from what happened. Yes, I am still afraid sometimes, but what I feel for you is not born of trauma. It is born of admiration and respect and something deeper that I do not yet have words for. Gideon stared at her, and in the moonlight she could see the war playing out across his features. I am not an easy man, Pearl. I am rough and set in my ways. I have lived alone for so long that I have forgotten how to be with other people. You deserve better than a mountain hermit who barely knows how to have a conversation. You have had more meaningful conversations with me in 5 days than I had with anyone in San Francisco in 2 years, Pearl countered. You listen when I speak. You treat me with respect and kindness. You make me feel valued and protected. How is that not enough? Because you deserve someone who can give you a proper life, Gideon said, his voice almost angry now, though she knew the anger was directed at himself, not her. Someone who can take you to dances and social gatherings. Someone who can give you beautiful dresses and a fine house, and all the things a woman like you should have. I had all those things in San Francisco, Pearl said quietly. And I was miserable. I was lonely and afraid and going through the motions of a life that felt empty. I do not want dances and parties, Gideon. I want a home. I want to build something real with someone who sees me for who I am, not what I can provide or what social status I can bring. I want someone who makes me feel safe and valued and understood. I want you. The last words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Gideon reached up and cupped her face in his large hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. You humble me, Pearl Bishop, he said softly. I do not know what I did to deserve your regard, but I swear to you, if you choose to stay, I will spend every day trying to be worthy of it. You already are, Pearl whispered, and then she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Gideon's other hand came up to cradle her face, and he deepened the kiss, pouring into it all the loneliness and longing he had kept locked away for so long. Pearl responded with equal fervor, her hands sliding up his chest to rest against his shoulders, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the fabric of his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. Are you certain? He asked one more time. This is what you truly want. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Pearl replied. I choose you, Gideon Ashford. I choose this life. I choose us. In the days that followed, Pearl sent word to her friend in Wasco that she would not be coming after all, that she had found a new path. The marshal came to take her statement about the attack, and she recounted it as calmly as she could, with Gideon sitting beside her, his presence a silent source of strength. The marshal informed them that the recovery party had found the stagecoach and retrieved the bodies, and that several of Mayer's gang had been captured, though Mayer himself remained at large. He will come after you eventually, the marshal warned Gideon. You wounded him and you cost him a prize he thought was his. Men like him do not forget slights like that. Let him come, Gideon replied calmly. I will be ready. But the weeks passed with no sign of Mayer or his remaining gang members. Autumn settled over the mountains, painting the aspens in brilliant gold and amber. Pearl threw herself into preparing for the winter, working alongside Gideon to preserve vegetables from his garden, smoke meat from his hunting, and ensure the cabin was stocked with everything they would need to survive the harsh months ahead. She discovered that she loved this life, loved the physical labor of it, the way each day brought tangible results. Her hands, once soft from years of delicate sewing, grew calloused and strong. Her arms developed lean muscle from hauling water and chopping kindling. She felt herself becoming someone new, or perhaps someone she had always been meant to be, and through it all, her relationship with Gideon deepened. They talked late into the night, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets. He taught her to shoot, to track, to read the signs of changing weather in the sky. She taught him to appreciate music, singing the songs her mother had taught her while she cooked. They moved around each other with increasing ease, developing the kind of wordless communication that spoke of true partnership. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, Gideon was always there, holding her and murmuring reassurances until the fear passed. She no longer felt embarrassed by her need for his presence. It had become simply a fact of their life together, as natural as breathing. It was in late October when Gideon rode into town for supplies and came back with a troubled expression. Pearl met him at the door, immediately sensing his unease. "What happened?" she asked. "Mayor escaped from custody," Gideon said grimly. "He killed a deputy and 2 other prisoners in the process. The marshal thinks he is heading back this way." Fear spiked through Pearl, but she forced it down. She had known this moment might come. "Then we prepare," she said firmly. "You have taught me to shoot. You have shown me how to defend this cabin. We will face him together." Gideon pulled her into his arms, and she could feel the tension thrumming through his powerful body. "I will not let him hurt you," he said fiercely. "I swear it, Pearl. I will die before I let him lay a hand on you." "You will not die," Pearl said just as fiercely, pulling back to look him in the eye. "We are both going to survive this, Gideon. We are going to have a life together. I refuse to accept any other outcome." They spent the next few days fortifying the cabin, checking and rechecking their ammunition, establishing clear lines of sight and defensive positions. Gideon was methodical and thorough, his military bearing suggesting he had prepared for situations like this before. The attack came on a cold, clear night 3 days later. Pearl woke to the sound of Gideon's hand covering her mouth gently, his lips close to her ear. "They are here," he whispered. 4 men, maybe 5. "Get dressed and take your position by the east window. Remember your training." Pearl's heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she pulled on her clothes and retrieved her rifle. She had practiced this scenario a dozen times over the past few days. She knew what to do. They moved through the darkened cabin to their positions. Gideon had extinguished all the lights hours ago, giving them the advantage of being able to see out while the attackers could not see in. Pearl crouched by the east window, rifle at the ready, while Gideon took the west. "Ashford." A voice called out from the darkness, slurred and angry. "Mayor, send out the girl and maybe I will let you live. Leave now and maybe I will let you live," Gideon called back, his voice calm and steady. Mayor's response was a barrage of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls, shattering the glass in the windows but not penetrating the heavy shutters behind them. Pearl flinched at the noise but kept her position, watching through the narrow gun slit for any sign of movement. "I see one," she called softly to Gideon. "Southeast corner behind the water trough." "Fire at will," Gideon replied. "Make them keep their heads down." Pearl took a breath, sighted carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, but she had been expecting it. Her bullet slammed into the water trough, sending splinters of wood flying. The man behind it yelped and scrambled backward. "Good shot," Gideon said approvingly. His own rifle barked twice, and Pearl heard a scream from outside. The siege continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Mayor's men tried repeatedly to rush the cabin, but Gideon's marksmanship drove them back each time. Pearl fired whenever she saw a target, not trying to kill but to keep the attackers pinned down and prevent them from advancing. Then, suddenly, there was silence. Pearl waited, barely breathing, her finger on the trigger. Minutes ticked by with no sound but her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "They are retreating," Gideon said finally. "I can hear their horses." Pearl sagged against the wall, relief making her lightheaded. But Gideon remained tense, his rifle still trained on the darkness outside. "Do not relax yet," he warned. "This could be a feint." They maintained their vigil through the rest of the night, taking turns watching while the other rested. It was only when the sun rose, revealing the empty clearing around the cabin, that Gideon finally allowed himself to stand down. "They are gone," he said. "For now, but they will be back." "Then we will face them again," Pearl said firmly. "Together." But when Gideon rode to town the next day to report the attack, he returned with surprising news. The marshal had tracked Mayer's gang to an abandoned mine, and in the resulting shootout, Mayer and his remaining men had been killed. "It is over," Gideon said, disbelief evident in his voice. "Mayer is dead. His gang is scattered. You are safe now, Pearl. Truly safe." Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of relief and joy rather than fear. She threw her arms around Gideon's neck, and he lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in a rare display of exuberance. That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner, but it felt like a feast. The shadow that had hung over them since the stagecoach attack had finally been lifted. They could begin to think about the future, about building a real life together. "Marry me," Gideon said suddenly, setting down his fork and looking at her with such intensity that Pearl's breath caught. "I know I should have courted you properly, should have asked your family's permission, should have done 100 things differently. But I love you, Pearl Bishop. I love your strength and your courage and your stubbornness. I love the way you hum while you work and the way you read poetry by the fire. I love that you chose this life, chose me, when you could have had anything else. Marry me and make this cabin a true home. Marry me and build a life with me in these mountains. Say yes and make me the happiest man alive." "Yes," Pearl said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes. I love you too, Gideon. I love your gentleness and your strength, the way you protect me without making me feel weak, the way you listen to me like my words matter. I love that you read Shakespeare and Homer, that you can track a deer through a forest and quote Whitman from memory. Yes, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. And in that moment, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Not in a city or a town, but here, in this cabin in the mountains, with this man who had saved her life and then taught her how to truly live. They were married in Kernville 2 weeks later, with the marshal and his wife standing as witnesses. Pearl wore a simple dress she had sewn herself from fabric. Gideon bought her in town. And Gideon wore clean buckskins and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. It was nothing like the grand wedding she might have had in San Francisco, but as they spoke their vows, Pearl knew she would not have traded it for anything in the world. The winter that followed was indeed harsh, as Gideon had warned. Snow fell thick and heavy, burying the cabin up to the windowsills. The temperatures plunged so low that water froze solid in its bucket overnight. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and love and laughter. Pearl discovered talents she had not known she possessed. She learned to cook with the limited ingredients available, creating meals that were simple but hearty and delicious. She improved her marksmanship until she could hit a target as well as Gideon could. She read her way through his entire collection of books and then started rereading them, each time finding new meaning in the familiar words. and she learned the rhythms of her husband's body and heart, the way he moved, the way he thought, the quiet ways he showed his love. Gideon was not a man of flowery words or grand gestures, but he showed his devotion in 100 small ways. The way he always made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. The way he brought her wildflowers when the weather permitted. The way he held her every night, his large body curled protectively around hers, keeping her safe and warm. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and coaxing new life from the frozen earth. Pearl planted a larger garden than Gideon had ever attempted, with vegetables and herbs and even some flowers for beauty. She watched with satisfaction as the seeds she had planted sprouted and grew, tangible evidence of the new life she was building. It was in late spring that she realized she was with child. The discovery filled her with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. When she told Gideon, he lifted her into his arms with a whoop of delight that echoed off the mountains. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Gideon fussed over her with an attentiveness that was both endearing and occasionally exasperating. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the cabin, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a cooking pot. He rode to town weekly to check with the doctor, making sure he knew exactly what to expect when the time came. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1878, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being thrust into the chilly world. Gideon, who had assisted with the births of countless animals but never a human child, was white-faced and shaking by the time it was over. But when Pearl placed the squalling infant in his arms, his expression transformed into something close to reverence. "He is perfect," Gideon whispered, his finger gently stroking the baby's impossibly small hand. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel after Gideon's father, and he grew into a sturdy, bright-eyed child who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Pearl watched with amazement as Gideon, this fierce mountain man who had seemed so solitary and self-sufficient, transformed into a devoted father. He carved toys for Daniel, told him stories about the animals of the forest, taught him to identify bird calls and track prints in the mud. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, whom they named Sarah for Pearl's mother. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's gray eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had Gideon wrapped around her tiny finger. Pearl often found him sitting by the cradle, simply watching their daughter sleep with an expression of such tender love that it made her heart ache. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and simple joys. Daniel grew tall and strong, learning to hunt and trap alongside his father. Sarah proved to have her mother's skill with a needle and her father's steady hand with a rifle. They added onto the cabin, building more bedrooms and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing family. Pearl's friend from Wasco visited occasionally, always marveling at the life Pearl had built in the mountains. "I cannot believe you are the same woman who arrived on that stagecoach so many years ago," she would say. "You have become someone entirely different." But Pearl knew that was not quite true. She had not become someone different. She had become more fully herself than she had ever been allowed to be in the city. The mountains had not changed her. They had freed her to become who she was always meant to be. Gideon aged well, his dark hair gaining distinguished silver at the temples, his body remaining powerful and capable even as the years accumulated. Pearl would sometimes watch him working, chopping wood or mending a fence, and marvel that this strong, gentle, devoted man was hers. That he had chosen her as surely as she had chosen him. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Gideon presented her with a small wooden box he had carved himself. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Pearl unfolded it and recognized her own handwriting, a letter she had written to her friend in Wasco all those years ago, telling her she would not be coming after all. "I found it among your things years ago," Gideon admitted. "I kept it because it represented the moment my life truly began. The moment you chose to stay, the moment you chose us." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "I have never regretted that choice," she said softly. "Not for a single moment." "Neither have I," Gideon replied, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me everything, Pearl. A home, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. You taught me that I did not have to live alone, that I was worthy of love. You saved me just as surely as I saved you that night." As Pearl rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she thought back to that terrified young woman who had been dragged from an overturned stagecoach all those years ago. She thought about the fear that had consumed her, the certainty that her life was over. She had been wrong. Her life had not ended that night. It had begun. In the arms of a mountain man who had stood guard over her, who had promised her safety, and who had given her something far more precious than mere protection. He had given her love, partnership, and a home in the wilderness that had become her sanctuary. Their daughter Sarah eventually married a young rancher from Kernville, a good man who reminded Pearl powerfully of Gideon in his quiet strength and steady devotion. Daniel chose to remain in the mountains, building his own cabin a few miles from theirs, and continuing the life his father had taught him to love. Pearl and Gideon grew old together, their bodies growing slower but their love growing only stronger. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the peaks that had witnessed their entire life together, and Pearl would think about how strange and wonderful life could be. She had boarded a stagecoach bound for a new life in Wasco, planning to start over as a seamstress in a small town. Instead, she had found something infinitely better: a true home, a great love, and a family that filled her heart to bursting. It was on a quiet autumn evening, when the aspens were once again painted gold, and the air held the first hint of winter's chill, that Gideon took Pearl's hand and led her to the small rise behind their cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and for a long moment they simply stood there hand in hand, taking in the beauty of their world. "You remember," Gideon said softly, "that first night, when you told me you had never felt safe enough to sleep without fear?" "I remember," Pearl replied, squeezing his hand. "And I remember you promising me I was safe, that I would always be safe with you." "I have tried to keep that promise every day since," Gideon said. "Have I succeeded?" Pearl turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "You have given me more than safety, my love. You have given me peace. You have given me joy. You have given me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. Every night I lay down beside you, I sleep without fear. Not because the world is any less dangerous, but because I know you are there. Because I know that whatever challenges come, we will face them together." Gideon pulled her close, and they stood there on the hillside as the sun sank below the mountains. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had weathered every storm. In the years that followed, they became the beloved patriarch and matriarch of a growing family. Grandchildren arrived, filling the cabin with laughter and noise. Daniel took over more and more of the hunting and trapping, allowing Gideon to slow down and enjoy the fruits of a life well lived. Sarah visited frequently with her own children, and Pearl delighted in teaching her granddaughters to sew while Gideon taught her grandsons to track. The cabin itself became a sort of legend in the area, a symbol of enduring love and frontier resilience. People would speak of the mountain man who had saved a woman from bandits and the seamstress who had chosen wilderness over civilization, and their story became part of the lore of the California mountains. Pearl lived to see her 80th birthday, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Her body had grown frail with age, her hands no longer steady enough for the delicate sewing she had once prized, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit undiminished. On her last evening, she sat on the porch with Gideon, watching another sunset paint the sky. His hair was completely white now, his powerful frame bent with age, but to Pearl, he was still the magnificent man who had emerged from the darkness to save her life all those decades ago. "I love you," she said softly, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I have loved you from that very first night, even though I did not know it yet. You were my salvation and my home." "And you were mine," Gideon replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day with you has been a gift, Pearl. Every single day." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to the love that had flourished in their shadow. Pearl passed peacefully in her sleep that night, cradled in Gideon's arms as she had been for so many thousands of nights before. He held her close until morning came, whispering words of love and gratitude into her hair, thanking her for the extraordinary life they had shared. Gideon followed her 6 months later, his heart simply giving out one winter morning as he sat in his chair by the fire. He was found with a smile on his face and a letter in his hands, one that Pearl had written him on their 50th anniversary, telling him once again how much she loved him and how grateful she was for the life they had built together. They were buried side by side on the hillside behind the cabin, where they had stood so many times watching the sun set over their beloved mountains. Their children and grandchildren maintained the cabin, keeping it as a testament to the love that had begun there, and visitors still came to hear the story of the mountain man and the seamstress who had found each other in the wilderness and built a love for the ages. The story of Pearl and Gideon became one that mothers told their daughters and fathers told their sons, a reminder that true love could be found in the most unexpected places, that courage came in many forms, and that the greatest adventures often began with the simplest choice: to stay, to trust, and to love without reservation. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the aspens and the stars emerged bright and clear above the mountains, some people claimed they could still feel the presence of two souls who had loved each other so completely that not even death could truly part them. They stood guard over the mountain still, these two who had promised each other safety and love, and had kept those promises through every trial and triumph life could offer. The cabin remained, weathered but sturdy, a testament to the life that had unfolded within its walls. The books still lined the shelves, the quilt still graced the bed, and the chairs still sat by the fireplace where two people had first begun to fall in love. And though Pearl and Gideon were gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the mountains they had called home, enduring and eternal, a beacon for all who came after them seeking the same courage to choose love over fear, wilderness over civilization, and to trust in the promise that with the right person, you would always, always be safe.